Good evening. My name is Bob Taylor. I'm the library manager for the West Virginia Archives and History Library. And as a part of our genealogy club, we have these Thursday night presentations. And upcoming for the Tuesday night lecture series, which is separate from this, we have History of Malden and the Salt Industry featuring Larry Rowe, and that happens June 5th. Now, the Native American Identity presentation will be July 10th by Andrea Franz. And the Genealogy Club lectures, the next one will be on June 14th, Gilbert Casto. It'll be History of Kanawha Valley, Fort Lee. There will be some artifacts here and reenacting information. Mary Glass is doing one on July the 12th, 1940 census. Now that might be interesting as well. But we are very honored and privileged tonight to have Dr. Cicero M. Fain. His topic tonight is Into the Crucible, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad and the Black Industrial Worker in Southern West Virginia, 1870 to 1900. This will be very interesting because it's going to deal with the contribution of black labor to this construction. Dr. Fain is a third-generation black Huntington, I can't say it. Huntingtonian, okay. And he is a recipient of the Carter G. Woodson Fellowship from Marshall University and a graduate of the Ohio State University, where he received his PhD in history. And he currently is assistant professor of history at the College of Southern Maryland. And it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Cicero Fain.
Well, thank you all for coming, taking time out of your busy lives to attend a lecture on something that's near and dear to my heart. I hope I don't bore you too much. I will try to, as best as possible to not stay too long in academic language, but as part of the process, I will dabble into academic language from time to time. Please forgive me. It is humbling as well as gratifying for you folks to be here. I have family, friends, teachers, students. It makes it all worthwhile. If you forgive me, I'm going to read. Most of you know the beginnings of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. It is, for those of us in a profession, to have an opportunity to lecture for an hour is uncalled for. I mean, we just don't get that opportunity. So you, for better or for worse, are a captive audience. They've told me they've locked the doors, and so here we shall endure for the next hour or so. So let us begin. In 1869, visionary railroad magnate Thomas B. Huntington began construction of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad through the New River Valley, initiating the industrialization of southern West Virginia. In his quest to complete the railroad from White Sulphur Springs to the Ohio River and thus connect Virginia's James River Valley to the Ohio River Valley, Huntington and his workers faced a staggering undertaking. More than a dozen tunnels were projected, aggregating some 24,000 linear feet, more than 4.5 miles. Enormous amounts of dirt and stone required removal. Miles of road beds adjacent to West Virginia's rivers had to be raised above flood level. To carry out his plans, Huntington needed millions of dollars and thousands of laborers to cross the rugged mountains of the southern part of the state. Though the number of whites and immigrant laborers involved in the construction of the railroad through southern West Virginia far exceeded that of blacks, black Southerners played an integral and vital role, felling forests, raising roads, driving spikes, laying track, and blasting tunnels. It was hard, demanding, and frequently dangerous work. In fact, not more than 125 miles southeast of Cabell County, in the primeval wilderness of the New River Valley, a stout and skilled John Henry, along with nearly 1,000 men, most of them African American, constructed the mile-long Big Bend Tunnel, quote, then the longest tunnel in America at the time of its completion, end quote. And like Henry, who achieved iconic status for his effort and questions regarding his authenticity, black workers also died. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. Yet despite the dangers for thousands of black migrants, the railroad offered opportunity. Attracted to the promise of wage labor employment with the upstart railroad, thousands of black workers poured into the primeval forests of the New River Valley. After completion of the railroad, many workers settled into adjacent towns, including Huntington. Founded in 1871 as a transshipment statement for the railroad on river frontage 4 miles west of the Gyandock River in the town of Gyandock, Huntington's increasing importance as an urban industrial center during the late 19th and early 20th century encouraged the influx of black migrants whose labor played a critical role in the city's rise to prominence as a manufacturing and commercial center. While a number of studies have focused on the experiences of black coal miners in the region, few have examined the experiences of black railroad workers and the integral role these workers played in the industrialization of southern West Virginia. This study serves as a corrective to this oversight and argues 3 points. That the construction of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad through the New River Valley was the second most important development in the history of this state. Number 2, that the construction was a racist enterprise and that the dominance of the railroad and the racism in the occupational structure and railroad-related unions in Huntington's industrial life was a key factor in the non-participation of African Americans in trade unionism in the city. So let me get those again. Number 1, the construction of the C&ORR Railroad is the second most important development in the history of this state. Number 2, that the construction of the C&ORR Railroad was a racist enterprise. And number 3, that racism impeded black progress, movement up the occupational ladder in Huntington, and I would argue throughout southern West Virginia. From the sweat and blood of black people, native-born whites, and European immigrants, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad advanced from the James River Valley to the Ohio River. As a white boy of 14, A.W. Alex Hamilton worked in early 1870 on the construction of West Virginia extension between White Sulphur Springs and Hawks Nest near Charleston. Born and raised near the James River Kanawha Turnpike, Hamilton's recollection that all the stone workers were Irish, end quote, illuminated the importance of immigrant labor to the railroad. He also recalled the importance and character of black labor. Quote, Negroes from Virginia and North Carolina, which were brought on the trains to White Sulphur Springs, where they began the long trek on foot over the James River and Kanawha Turnpike, now Midland Trail, to the points where they were to work. These gains would run from 1 to 300, accompanied by chuck wagon and the boss or bosses in charge, end quote. Overwhelmingly composed of single man, work gangs frequently existed on the frontier in isolated work camps. Notably, though, some of these camps grew into enclaves, boom towns, and even communities, with many named after railroad officials: Alderson, Crozet, Talcott, Thurman, Huntington, and Parsons, to name a few. Addressing the establishment of shantytowns affiliated with work camps, one historian relays, quote, many of these shantytowns developed into prominent communities with stores, churches, and schools, serving the needs of construction crews, end quote. Importantly, life in the work camps provided opportunity. Extended periods of isolation afforded time to save substantial sums of money. Many black laborers acquired enough money to purchase farms when the road they were working on was completed, Many also acquired skills and took great pride in blacksmithing, masonry, tunneling, and mining. Given their number, efficacy, and cost, there is little doubt that African American laborers were a critical labor force on the Chesapeake and Ohio. Contributing to the development was the known quality of black labor and the unknown worthiness of the European immigrant. As Hamilton noted, at least as far as the railroad in the New River Valley was concerned, in 1870, quote, the Italian had not been invented, end quote. One Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad document published in 1873 by the New York banking firm Fisk and Hatch commented on the perceived physical and cultural limitations of the European immigrant as a worker within the New River Valley. Quote, to the European immigrant unaccustomed to the use of the axe, this fine growth of timber has been deemed an objection, and he has winded his way to the prairies of the West with the chills and the fevers which most surely destroy the general health of his family, rather than undergo the unaccompanied task of clearing in the mountain forest the acres he needs. Interestingly, unlike the work environment of more southerly railroads, there seems to have been little racial strife in the construction of the C&O. Perhaps part of the reason is the accounts of the construction of the line were overwhelmingly produced by white observers. While acknowledging the color line and living accommodations, these accounts depicted harmonious relations on the line. Another reason is that there existed little wage discrimination between the races, with skilled African American laborers earning proportionally more than their unskilled white counterparts. Charles Nordhoff, a New York writer who toured the line in 1871, noted, quote, whenever we rolled, I saw whites and Negroes working together, pushing at the same car, shoveling at the same dirt heap, lifting together at one rock. In their work, there is absolutely no distinction of color, nor did I in any case see any dislike or bullying of a colored man by a white man. Certainly, end quote, excuse me. Certainly another factor to consider is that black laborers were aware of the constraints impacting their employment. While white accounts of black laborers by engineers and contractors celebrated their industriousness, aptitude, and equanimity, it is important to note that, quote, in order to maintain his position, the Negro laborer had to be sober, hardworking, and well-disciplined, end quote. There is, however, evidence of resistance by black laborers to the dictates of industrial capitalism. On at least one occasion, white engineers and contractors supervising construction of the line through the New River Valley complained that many of the Negroes, quote, would go home to Virginia during harvest and Christmas time, thus delaying the progress of the road, end quote. In 1870, black and white workers all down the line from Guyandotte to Charleston struck when they were denied a pay increase from $1.50 to $1.75 per day. The fact that black workers felt empowered enough to resist the pressures and mandates imposed by the railroad, and by extension the wage capitalist system, suggests that they recognized their value as workers, that they just weren't cogs in the machine exclusively. While few authoritative records detailing the experiences of the labor force in the construction of the Big Bend survive, examination of the particulars illuminates a great deal about the nature and peril of early black migrant labor, and in fact, labor, period, on the railroad. Foremost was the setting. In his travels over the Chesapeake and Ohio, Northcutt describes the region, quote, when we mounted our horses and bade goodbye to roads and entered the New River country, a howling wilderness through which the engineer parties of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad have constructed what it pleases them to call a path. If you've ridden in the Yosemite, you will not find a trail steeper or more difficult than the curious descent, and not 2 miles before 80 long. More than 2 years were consumed in the survey of that wild country, end quote. Another traveler conveyed the conditions endured by some residents of the valley when he stated, quote, no house of any kind, only squalid log shanties filled with Negroes and miserable white men, end quote. To attract laborers to the mountain, ex-Confederate Army captain John Johnson recruited among his pool ex-slaves to the precarious worksite. Johnson was just one of the many ex-Confederates employed by the railroad in positions of authority in the New River Valley, including Claiborne R. Mason, Colonel T.M.R. Talcott, General William C. Wiggum, and Cobb County resident and one-time Sheriff George McHenry. One historian relays that, quote, Mason's long experience controlling men and recapturing runaways made him an able if brutal boss for the C&O. Many Southerners already hated and feared Mason for what he had done to stop Confederate desertions, end quote. While the exact composition of work crews at Big Bend is unknown, the Richmond Dispatch reports in 1872, quote, the Negroes are the majority. They are preferred because you can cuss a nigger, but whenever an attempt is made to abuse a white, there is a row, end quote. One writer relays that as the ranks diminished by accident, disease, and death, Johnson and other CIO contractors dispatched agents south to fetch new workers for rendezvous with the mountain. Once hired, it was hard to break Johnson's hold. Such contractors kept their workers isolated, far from home, and often deep in debt to the commissary. No doubt many owed their souls to the company's store, as the later song about coal miners put it. Constructing a road through the mountains was an exceedingly difficult task with no mechanized equipment available and seemingly insurmountable engineering problems. Thus, work on the railroad was dangerous, arduous, and backbreaking for all. Nitroglycerin, silicosis, which is called tunnel fever, landslides, derailments, and a variety of accidents contributed to a massive casualty rate. Fatalities among tunnel workers are believed to be incredibly high. Many died of tunnel fever caused by the fetid stone dust generated by the nitroglycerin explosives and the smoldering heat encountered in the poorly ventilated cavern. In total, 83,000 pounds of explosives were used constructing the tunnel. So dangerous was nitroglycerin during this period that the Nitroglycerin Act was passed in 1869, forbidding its use without the permission of the Secretary of State. So widespread was concern that in 1871, the editors of Scientific America argued against the general indiscriminate use of the explosive. Normally delivered frozen to reduce accidents, Louis Chappelle states, quote, that such precautions taken against the dangers of nitroglycerin in the hands of Negroes in the Big Bend Tunnel and elsewhere in the C&ORR Railroad seems to lack support in the records, end quote. Accidents resulting from bungled blasting and falling rocks were widespread. One historian, quote, estimates that hundreds of laborers, men and boys, of African and Irish descent perished during the 3-year construction of the tunnel. The dead were quickly buried and unceremoniously in 8 makeshift pits near the portals at both ends and covered with rocks, end quote. Another authority argues it was in the best interest of the C&O contractors to keep the workers obscure, their origins obscure. Quote, Negroes who died in the Big Bend hailed from nowhere and had not been christened, he observed. And it was easy to notice when such men were used up and cast aside, end quote. Freeman James Henry Yancey noted that no one knows how many men or mules died in the deadly construction of the Big Bend Tunnel, an area he worked on the Lane Railroad from 1870 to 1874 before acquiring employment in Huntington at the C&O shops. One black mountaineer whose 2 cousins labored in the tunnel recalled the fate of many workers. Quote, they said Big Bend Tunnel was a terrible-like place, and many men got killed there. Mules too. And they throw the dead men and mules and all together there in that field between the mountains, end quote. The death of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of free African-American workers, as well as those 380 African-American convicts leased by the Virginia State Penitentiary to the railroad between 1871 and 1872 occurred during the construction through the Howling Wilderness. These deaths probably raised no outcry because thousands of black migrant laborers in the New River Valley were introduced to the machinations of industrial labor under the supervision of a number of ex-Confederates who were beholden to the dictates of capitalism and racism. Black laborers also died at the construction of the railroads. And this is the two slides I've shown are, this is Big Bend, on the east portal of the Big Bend Tunnel, circa 1871, I believe, 1872. The other one was another picture of black laborers, black migrant laborers who were working on the construction of the C&ORR Railroad. Black laborers also died at the completion of the construction, and the railroad became operational. Numerous newspaper articles detail the occupational hazards resulting in working, including loss of limb, injury, death. During the summer of 1875, 2 black laborers in Huntington area were killed within a month of each other, including Lewis Richardson, quote, "a very good man who has worked on the train for 3 years," end quote. Richardson's death resulted from a fall between the cars in which, I'm going to be graphic here, quote, "the train ran over him and cut his head right in two, throwing teeth and brains off on one side of the track," end quote, illustrating the dangers of railroad employment for novice and experienced alike. In fact, in 1880, the second leading cause of accidental death for men between the ages of 20 and 60 within the Ohio River Valley was railroad-related accidents. To what extent C.P. Huntington knew or cared about the day-to-day operations at Big Bend or the C&ORR Railroad construction through the New River Valley, or the reputed death toll, is speculative. However, beyond dispute, there are 3 facts. Number 1, he needed to sell $10 million in bonds to New York investors. He promised the Virginia legislature to finish the tunneling by 1872. And he thought nitroglycerin critical to achieving his plans. It is difficult to imagine an overriding concern on his part for the general labor or work site issues. That was the job of his subordinates, the contractors, engineers, managers, directors, and superintendents. In fact, it is much more likely that Huntington spent his time dealing with the company's substantial debt load, which increased dramatically during the construction of the tunnel and the railway to Huntington. Now, despite the dangers, the railroad provided opportunity for black migrants seeking gainful employment. In 1871, the railroad employed 5,000 black laborers. By the fall of 1871, Huntington served as a center of much of this activity, with more than 1,000 men employed in the various projects in the intermediate proximity of the town. Though the number of whites and immigrant laborers far exceeded blacks, the number of blacks, blacks were critical to the construction, as stated before. Most of the laborers were day laborers who worked on the line. They were free blacks from Eastern Virginia who were drawn to the railroad by high wages. In 1871, the Charlottesville Chronicle complained that the Chesapeake and Ohio was draining off all Negro labor in Virginia, leaving many farms and plantations neglected. As an editor affirmed, quote, "they will listen much more readily to the agents of the railroad companies than to the planter," end quote. As historian A.A. Taylor remarks, quote, "testimony was all but unanimous that the migrant labor was efficient," end quote. In 1870, the Cabell County Press, published out of Milton, I believe, reported, quote, "work has now been regularly commenced on nearly every section from Guyandotte to Charleston. There are at present about 300 Negroes engaged in different sections of the work. We learned that they make excellent hands," end quote. By the fall of 1871, Huntington served as the center of much of this activity. And not only that, black workers undoubtedly worked in the completion of the line from Huntington to Charleston in December 1872, from there to Colberry in March of 1872, and to the Kanawha Falls in June of 1871. Referring to migrant laborers in West Virginia and Ohio, a correspondent for a Cincinnati newspaper wrote in 1872, quote, I am informed by the contractors that the Negroes make the most faithful hands they can get, end quote. Now, the C&O was the ignition. Coal was the fuel for both Huntington's dramatic economic expanse, the state's dramatic economic growth, and black influx into the Central Appalachian Plateau. You see here a map, a graph of the influx of black migrant labor. This is the Central Appalachian coal fields, this region here, the main counties comprising the Central Appalachian coal fields. This expanse, the Central Appalachian Plateau, this expanse comprising 9 counties in central and southern West Virginia, as well as parts of eastern Kentucky, southwestern Virginia, and northern Tennessee, lacked the required transportation networks prior to the completion of the C&ORR Railroad to move economically the more than 50 million acres of fossil fuel, the nation's largest supply. In 1871, though coal was not yet king in the Central Appalachian Plateau, in 1871, though coal was not yet king, West Virginia's topography and the sheer scope and volume of its southern coal fields initially slowed capital infusion and worker influx throughout the 1870s. However, the rate for both would increase substantially by the 1880s. Yet even with the retarded growth, substantial rewards awaited. Historically, the 5 southern counties of West Virginia, Fayette, McDowell, Raleigh, Mercer, and Wyoming, and a bit of Tazewell County, Virginia, were collectively known as the smokeless coal fields, home to the highest quality coal, and deemed, as Charles Sullivan states, quote, literally too precious to burn in the ordinary sense, end quote. The opening up of nearly 420 miles of railroad through stretches of dense and difficult terrain from Ohio into Virginia heralded a dramatic transformation of the Central Appalachian Plateau and would not have occurred without substantial financial assistance from local and state authorities. The conclusion, quote, marked an epoch of new growth for a vast area and opened a new channel of trade between the East and the West, end quote. An Ironton, Ohio newspaper reported, before concluding, quote, the effect that the opening must have in the development of West Virginia can hardly be overestimated, end quote. Thus, in 1873, when the first C&ORR Railroad train traveled west down the iron rails from Charleston to Huntington, linking the Ohio Valley with the Kanawha and New River Gorge and Richmond further east, it initiated the industrialization of the Central Appalachian coal fields and the rise of an industrial city, Huntington. The region's political, economy, and cultural moorings were immediately and irrevocably changed in the process, altering, quote, the fundamental patterns of mountain life, end quote. Among the public ceremonies commemorating the event was one in which a barrel of water from the James River was poured into the Ohio River at Huntington. Soon thereafter, as Serinda Evans states, quote, a trainload of coal arrived at Huntington every night about 12 o'clock. The coal was put on barges ready for the towboats to take down the Ohio the next day. Sometimes as many as 10,000 bushels of coal were shipped in one day. The use of indigenous agents to administer, supervise, and construct the C&ORR Railroad helped transition the region from a pre-industrial market system to an industrialized one, a more modern system. Completion of the railroad linked the world to the world capitalist, linked the region to the world capitalistic system, in which it operated within a web of assorted stages of incorporation. The core is the major metropoles of the investment capital and commerce. The semi-periphery regions are highly developed commercial staging areas for capital and trade. And the regions are the peripheral of the system. In essence, Huntington, or New York was linked to Huntington, Huntington was linked to the coal fields, And you have this concentric circle expanding out. The infusion of capital from New York City bankers, the establishment of Huntington as a transshipment station, and the penetration of the New River Valley reestablished, reconfigured, and dramatically expanded the region's links to the world capitalistic system through the transportation of goods and services and the extraction of timber, oil, gas, and coal. In effect, as Ron Lewis writes, complicating a historical model of Appalachian economic development, change was not simply an external imposition, end quote. Connection to the world marketplace did not come without challenges, however. I mentioned Huntington having to deal with debt, continuous debt with his railroad. The debt impacted his ability to not only construct various lines, but also to pay his workers. The best example I could give would be the Depression of 1873, in which a terrible crash of 1873 plunged the whole country into gloom. Money markets fell, the government stopped specie payment, and the C&O on which the railroad town depended almost quit. This is a newspaper reporting in Huntington. No pay card came to the town for 6 months. Wage earners were in near riot. Other citizens began to leave for better points. The Depression exacerbated an already untenable financial situation in for Huntington. That year, in 1873, the average cost per mile of the C&O Railroad was $88,000 per mile, nearly 2.5 times the $36,000 average per mile of Southern railroads. As one authority notes, quote, so deficient were the company's operating funds that for 5 months after the completion of the line to Huntington, the employees of the railroad received no pay, end quote. In December 1873, with the Depression deepening, C&O railroads employees were paid in script, bearing the promise, end quote, to pay in 30, 60, or 90 days. So you're on the verge of the holiday season with no money, and no promise of getting that money really for possibly up to 90 days. Fortunately, that winter, only the personal intervention of W.C. Wickham, then vice president of the company, ensured the extension of further credit for a limited time to the company's laborers by the city merchants. Local employees continued to suffer from the railroad's financial difficulties until at least May of 1874, when one local newspaper noted, quote, the pay card of the C&O Railroad visited Huntington on last Monday and paid the employees in 30 and 60 days script. Now, for those that don't know, script was utilized with great regularity in the isolated mining and logging towns of Central Appalachia during the late 19th and early 20th century. In effect, substitute currency, script usually confined workers' purchasing power for meals and goods to the company-owned store or designated proxies. Forced to pay markups for meals and or goods purchased, employees frequently were subject to the dictates of the company, reinforcing their dependency and powerlessness. Still, its utilization certainly demonstrates some sense of employer obligation and responsibility for the well-being of its employees. I mean, it could have not paid them anything. Moreover, given that no other alternatives were presented, the use of script in lieu of cash wages was certainly better than not receiving either. The effects of the Depression lingered for 15 years, impacting the industrial development of the entire state, with only 2 small rural developments, a short line north of Wheeling and a narrow gauge from Weston to Clarksburg, were the only 2 completed between 1873 and 1881. It should be said that the importance of linking black migrant influx to available jobs, fringe benefits, and the possibility of long-term employment were the driving force. Not so much the enfranchisement of black laborers. In essence, what I'm trying to get at is it was jobs that was more important than the ability to vote. Black workers certainly recognize the importance of their ability to utilize political power, but the primary rationale, the primary reason for them coming was to gain jobs, to gain money. That's what you needed. And that was their primary goal initially. This may upset folks who think that, you know, there was some exceptionalism in the fact that the state was born out of this quest to be a non-slave state. And that certainly is important to recognize. However, black people came because they had jobs here. And in fact, I have a number of folks who gained, black migrants who came over from Central Virginia who gained employment. Amongst them would be one of the first group of black migrants into Huntington would be a gentleman by the name of Nelson Barnett, who was a reverend at that time, whose family would, of course, achieve great prominence in Huntington, and would be related to, who would spawn, the family would have the professional doctors that would become leading citizens of the city, and in fact of the state. Nelson Barnett Jr., citing oral tradition within the family, believes that his great-great-grandfather, Nelson Barnett, actually gained employment after meeting C.P. Huntington. Nell Rafford Francisco, a 1911 graduate of Huntington's Black Douglas High, says of her father, William Anderson Rafford, quote, "I don't know about father driving spikes or laying rails, but he sure cleared the bushes so the C&ORR shops could be built," end quote. Bessie Woodson Yancey, sister of eminent historian Carter G. Woodson, and a 1901 graduate of Douglas, wrote, quote, "From 1870 to 1874, father worked as a laborer in constructing the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad through the center of this state and served this company later as a worker in its shops in Huntington," end quote. Not only did black men obtain jobs with the railroad, some obtained formal authority. After working for the C&O on the White Sulphur Springs extension connecting the Big Bend Tunnel near Talcott, transplanted Youngstown, Ohio resident Charles H. Anderson recalled, quote, "I worked on the railroad bossing. I always had men under me," end quote. Now, within a decade of the completion of, I had an earlier map that showed the two rail lines coming through the, southern West Virginia. That second line would be the completion of the Norfolk and Western Railroad, which would line southwest of the C&O line, which linked the fields of southern West Virginia and southwestern Virginia to Norfolk, eventually along the Wyandotte River Valley to the Great Lakes. Importantly, assisted by a large number of black workers, the N&W later connected the, quote, billion-dollar, end quote, Pocahontas field to national markets. The two railroads, with their web of main lines, branch lines, and feeder lines, combined to connect the countless coal mines and coke ovens that began to dot the region. By the end of the 19th century, at least 4 major geographically interlocking coal fields have been discovered in West Virginia: the Kanawha and New River Field, the Winding Gulf Field, the Williamson-Logan Field, and the Pocahontas Field, which employed 100,000 miners by the early 1900s. Affiliated with these developments were the formation of towns and cities along the rail lines, including Bramwell, Beckley, Keystone, Welch, Williamson, Canova, and the most important, Bluefield, known as the gateway to the Pocahontas coal field, which mirrored Huntington's impressive growth during the late 19th and early 20th century. Before arriving in Huntington in 1895, brothers Carter and Robert Woodson worked on the railroad, then in the coal mines of Fayette County. In effect, black migrants seeking to improve their lives by negotiating and navigating what Joe W. Trotter calls the dynamics of industrial capitalism transformed the industrial labor force of West Virginia. Some of this formation resulted from changes in the population itself. While the population of the state increased by a rate of 17% in the 1860s, in the decade of the 1870s, the population rose by 40%. In the 6 counties contiguous to the C&ORR line, the number of residents grew by more than 59% between 1870 and 1880. The increase of black residents in these counties rose by more than 89% in the decade. In the process, the influx reversed the trend of black outmigration experienced in the region during the 1860s and the Civil War era. Now, shifting over to Huntington. Prior to the construction of the C&ORR Railroad, Huntington was an agriculturally dominated local economy. You had many black workers, John Shaver, James Johnson, and Elijah Tucker, who were self-employed black farmers. However, most of the majority of the population, within Calvert County, black population, worked on white-owned farms as they had in the 1860s. I wanted to at least show you some of the population increase for the state and for Huntington. Throughout the decades.
Could I ask what 1880 is like that jump?
Yes. You said it's like a jump?
Well,
Oh, strong.
yeah.
Hi. Where, in Huntington or?
Total population for Huntington, 1870.
Yes.
1883,000?
Uh-huh.
Oh,
The Depression of 1873.
oh.
Had a big
so
impact.
People moved out.
Yes.
The railroad was finished then, too.
Yeah. And true, the railroad's finished then. Okay. It should be noted that there were only two, in 1870, there were only 2 of the 123 black residents of Huntington who worked on the railroad in 1870. As I said before, most of the workers worked on white-owned farms. 18 males worked as farm workers in 1870. There were some who worked as a drayman, as barbers, laborers. For the most part, the distribution of distribution of employees, male workers, were distributed in the following occupations: 18 farm workers, 5 farmers, 2 railroad laborers, 2 laborers, 1 drayman, and 1 barber. Given the time and place, mirroring the low level of gainfully employed women in the state, it is not surprising that the occupational range for the counties, for Calvert County's 34 black females in 1870 were even more limited than the occupational options for black males. In 1870, 13 females, 38%, are cited as domestics. 5 are cited as remaining at home, while 16 are cited as housekeepers. Now, in 1880, of the city's 130 black female workers, 40 are domestic, and 76 are keeping house or keeper of the house. In essence, most of the women were confined to the domestic arena. Really that's not an earth-shattering conclusion, given the era. Whether it was domestic work in white-owned homes or domestic work in their own homes. In 1880, the census cites no black female dressmakers, hairdressers, laundresses, cooks, or nurses. The lack of occupational diversity among these women only serves to highlight their importance in establishing and maintaining households in the pre-industrial economy. With limited employment options, women supported themselves, their families, and communities in important and vital ways. Household duties, childbearing responsibilities provided the emotional, psychological, and social stability needed to sustain and maintain a fledgling home. Sewing, cooking, cleaning, retrieving water, childbearing, supervision, feeding, and shopping were some of the routine chores. In truth, women performed immense quantities of indispensable labor. In such an environment, household maintenance and family stability occupied much of their time and energy. Now, shifting over to 1880, it's not surprising that unskilled laborers comprised the largest percentage of the black workforce. In total, 131 workers, nearly 67% of the employed black male population. These numbers reveal how important black laborers were to Huntington's development and illuminate the shift from agriculturally based occupations. In comparison to 1870, when 23 African Americans cited their occupation as farmer or farm worker, only 6 cited that same occupation in 1880, representing an even smaller proportion of black population. Now employed as a foundry worker, 31-year-old William Black was emblematic of another profound shift experienced by many of the county's black residents, from slave to wage earner. William had been a slave for William F. Dusenberry of Barbersville. Gained his freedom when traveling up and down the Ohio River, traveling to Cincinnati, other points, eventually returned to the county, was able to acquire gainful employment and climb up the economic ladder. By 1880, 21 blacks, 11% were employed in the railroad industry, a substantive increase from the 2 employed in 1870. Expanding the base to include the county's 342 wage-earning African-American males between the ages of 14 and 75 shows fully 158 were employed as railroad worker or works on railroads, further demonstrating the growing pool of railroad employment in the county. Moreover, west of Cabell and adjacent Wayne County, 45 black laborers, 43 of them Virginian-born, worked on the railroad in 1880. Out of the total population of 219 blacks and mulattoes, the 45 represented 20% of the county's total black population. Analysis of Huntington's black workers suggests that some responsibility for the absence of working class agitation or union formation, black or interracially led, belongs with them. That no black labor leader emerged from Huntington's black working class during the city's early years is suggestive and calls into question the nature of black agency and black community. Moreover, the city's black religious leaders demonstrated no articulated formal support or on behalf of the black working class, nor any political action to address their conditions. In essence, what we have is class stratification within the black community. This is noteworthy given that in 1890, the Western Division of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, based in Huntington, employed 1,100 black employees in various capacities. Some suggestions of the occupational constraints imposed upon the company's black workers is shown by the fact that from 1871 to 1900, no African Americans are among the 42 workers listed on the C&ORR engineer and fireman's age roster of the Huntington Division, nor are any among the 7 cited in the conductors and brakemen seniority list of the Huntington Division covering the same period. So in essence, locked at the bottom of black people, black migrants, utilized the solace of family, community, and social freedom, and the explicit labor threat of replacement labor to modify and conduct their lives. Certainly the fact that they could be replaced at most any time provided a disincentive for militant labor agitation. Ostracized and trapped at the bottom of the occupational ladder, prevailing circumstances compelled a level of thoughtfulness and appraisal among black common laborers, understandably producing a heightened level of conservatism among the black masses. As Black Huntington resident Professor J.W. Scott accurately noted in 1903 of the city's black laborers, quote, "They could do no skilled work and they had no knowledge of business," end quote. It certainly is up for debate about that quote, but in essence, the general sentiment is true. Thus, black migrants' ability to address workplace constraints and formulate effective strategies and or tactics were severely limited. Yet, importantly, economic gains were made. And the reason why I bring up this interracial union, whether it's a black unionism or interracial unionism, excuse me, is because it existed in the coalfields to some extent. It existed in Richmond, within the urban industrial environment of Richmond. So there were models to observe and to perhaps follow. Individually and collectively, during the latter part of the 19th century, black workers' labor and agency were critical to the construction of the C&ORR Railroad, the industrialization of southern West Virginia, and the rise of Huntington. It should be noted that by 1900, Huntington is the second largest city in the state. I do believe that's correct. It may be 1930, I got to get that correct, but I think it's 1900. Let me see what we got. Yeah, I think it is the second largest city in the state by that time. Wheeling is certainly the largest city at that time, but Huntington will surpass Wheeling, I believe, by 1930. Notably, not unlike the web of relations initiated by the C&O development within the Appalachia, New River Valley, black workers' labor helped link various economic sectors within the town to each other and to the broader economy. Operating in the streets as hod carriers, as draymen, as porters, as drivers and teamsters, black labor proved crucial to the development of Huntington's industrial economy via the transportation of goods and services. Not unlike the C&ORR Railroad, in the macro level, the same thing is happening at the micro level, the local level, with Huntington's black laborers. Evidence indicates that most of Huntington's black laboring class, male and female, like black workers nationwide, found gainful employment in Huntington's emergent industrial capitalist economy. Importantly, as the city grew, black residents benefited from increasing occupational diversity, if not upward mobility. I would argue also there was a shift, an important shift in mindset, in mentality, which is just as important in dealing with the constraints, occupational constraints, and of course segregation during this era, is the fact that you feel your life is getting better, okay? And that there's tangible proof that it is moving forward. In the process of performing the most arduous and dangerous jobs, they acquired new skills, they acquired autonomy, they acquired authority. In their striving, their success provides a compelling historical counterpoint to the tragic tale of John Henry. Yet largely unskilled, untrained, and illiterate, the first generation of black workers into southern West Virginia and Huntington remained locked at the bottom of the occupational ladder and beholden to the dictates of industrial racism and capitalism. For the vast majority of black workers, though, the transition to urban industrial employment entailed some progress. Flawed, ugly, but ultimately life-affirming. Thank you. Well, I'm sure I hope there are some questions. Please.
Well, it's interesting. It's really hard to pull
coal mining away from the railroad. But one of the things I do a lot of when we hear the storage area is the coal ovens, the placement of the coal ovens. That was mutual decisions for benefit of the railroads, which was typically right beside the railroad track.
Mm-hmm.
The coal island mines down toward, when the kettles down to the railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And typically, the house segregation of the blacks were the worst possible housing situation because that coke was burned there.
Mm-hmm.
The smoke, the environment,
Sure.
the areas. And
Sure.
Hansted,
So ecological racism.
and Hansted is perfect. They have a rail trail there. The mine was on the hillside.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, it's there. It permeates the whole area.
Sure.
Have you ever done studies in relationship to coke ovens?
I have not. No. That's something to definitely look at. Yes, sir.
It's a drayman.
A drayman is a gentleman who's transporting, he's got the, I want to say the wagons, and he's transporting things here and there. Now, I may get this may be the gentleman who's also, let me get this correct. This may be the gentleman who's transporting water. Because you had the wells, and you had to get folks who transported the water from one place to another. So I think that's more, the more accurate description of him. Is that right? Greg, help me out.
I think it's with wagons. Yeah,
Wagons, yeah.
Wagonman, yeah.
Okay, okay.
I was gonna ask, now, I'm looking at 1870, say, the black population, say, in Huntington, right there.
Sure.
You know, with the rise of the Democratic Party again, with the conservatives coming back into power all across West Virginia, if you were an ambitious young man and you were an African American, it seemed to me like you're looking at Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland, and it's just right across the river.
Sure, sure.
Do you feel that some of that population began to leave?
There is not, possibly. I think Huntington remains a working class for most black folks. The first generation, I would say, from 1870 to 1900, that's what I'm concentrating on. They were predominantly working class folks. It's from 1890 forward when you have the development of the professional class. And then from there you have influx into the political environment at the local level. Not really impacting much change, really. At least you have folks who are aspirational, who are putting themselves on a ticket. But does it have any my view is that it doesn't really amount to any political gain for the black population for that period.
That period that we're talking about, where Huntington's just starting to develop, the Meigs County area of Ohio and the surrounding counties, the counterparts across the river in West Virginia, they call it the Big Bend area of the Ohio River.
Mm-hmm.
We had been really big in salt production around the Civil War ages here in Kanawha Valley. They outgrew us in a tremendous way.
Really?
And they had coal being developed at the same time, and so that area was ripe for
Sure.
development. And I think that's one of the reasons why probably Huntington went into that area.
And you know, I don't want to paint a tragic picture of, I call this Into the Crucible, because it was hell. You know, black workers had, and in fact, you know, not only, it's not just black workers, it's European immigrants and poor whites had very little power to affect their circumstance in any appreciable way. They were beholden to the dictates of C&O, his cronies, and to the wage capitalist system. You had to make money, and what you did, you know, if you want to feed your families or feed yourself, you got to go out and find a job. Okay, and so your choices are very limited. It is, but the one, I keep coming back to the one arena in which black people could gain some sense of self, some sense of place, solace, would be the black community. And you talked about the communities that are existent on the other side of the railroad. Burlington, Ohio had been a long time black enclave. And so then you expanded to Ironton. And so there is this kind of interrelated, broader community, I think, that exists amongst blacks Ironton, Ashland, and Huntington, as well as the smaller black communities of Proctorville, Burlington, South Point, that allowed for black people to have a sense of safety, of a sense of interrelation, of a relationship that, you know, that we can share, we can commune, we can fellowship, and then we can go about and deal with life, the harshness of life on you know, Monday through Friday. And that's why the black church is so critical, as well as the, you know, development of black schools during this era. Yes, sir.
Well, that was literally, that area you're talking about, describing America and all through there, that was literally the Underground Railroad.
Yes, and that's, yes.
Civil War, during the Civil War, that was the Underground Railroad's heart.
Yes.
If you could get to Ohio, if you could cross the Ohio River,
Sure.
you had people waiting. And you had people on this side.
Yes.
People in Mason County were very, very much part of the Underground Railroad.
Yeah. I talk about a little bit of that in the first chapter of my dissertation. And I do want to say, Greg, I'm going to get the dissertation to you hopefully by the end of June. I'll make that promise to you. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Hello.
Hi. You look familiar, buddy.
Jeanette.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
I'm doing Barbersville.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, when you talk about the Big Bend Tunnel and, you know, just the mass burials of these unidentified
Sure.
Black and white workers, was there never any kind of roster or any kind of record ever maintained of the railroad workers generally?
Not that I know
They were
of.
contracted.
Not that I know of.
Oh.
The only reason, the Scott Reynolds Nelson, a scholar out of, it was then William and Mary, wrote a book on Southern railroads and John Henry, and he was able to, at least, you know, when we talk about convicts, the prison had records. So he was able to trace back from the prison account, the records. But I don't know, the only place I haven't been, well, there are a lot of places I haven't been, I'm doing the research, but the most prominent place I haven't been so far is the Western Reserve, I believe, in Cleveland. And one of my reviewers of an article suggested I get up there because there are records up there of that Huntington, C.P. Huntington might have, that would give me insight into his thoughts about employees, the labor force, and how they were being treated. At this time, I haven't made it up there, but I don't know of any, and I've been to Clifton Forge for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Historical Society. I've gone through a great deal of research. I have not come across anything other than records detailing really the managerial level. I mean, in essence, who cared about these migrants?
Well, they were subcontracted as well, weren't they?
They are disposable labor, and they are passing through. And at this time, the task is to get the job done, no matter the cost.
What would have contributed to that sense of community? I mean, would it be the fact that they didn't so the lack of agitation itself is a community,
The fact that you didn't have interracial unionism, I think, was an indicator of the unwillingness of whites to come together to consider it. And so, if you are mindful of that, you know that it's a lost cause trying to establish it. And so, in essence, you circle your wagons. Is that what you were asking me?
essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, with lacking the force of the union movement,
Yeah.
that tended to combine a lot of the African American white communities in
Sure.
coal mining regions.
Yeah.
Lacking that force, what would have, I mean, I know that all communities had that sense, but I mean, when you're talking about the southern half of West Virginia,
Sure.
and you look at integration and things of that nature,
What-
you're coming down to, they were the last, few because of the racial tension. So lacking that, their community was, I'm assuming, on the lack of labor, so either way.
Sure. I don't think whites felt compelled. I don't think whites valued a union. I don't think there was any necessity for them to seek out unionization within the railroads.
Okay, so it's because the whites didn't instigate the labor union movement, then
Right.
there would be nothing.
They're on top. They are you know, reaping the benefits of their class and racial status. And so then what is their incentive for them to unite with you know, these blacks, who are, in essence, competitors for their jobs? And it is interesting to note that I want to, don't quote me too much on this, but I want to believe by 1890, Huntington is one of the whitest cities in America. I mean, it's something to the extent of 96% of its population is white. And not, I hate to cast this term white because it kind of makes it a monolithic type of model. But in essence, you have European immigrants, you have Anglos who are either consciously or unconsciously imbibing the same type of racialized sentiment, segregationists. You know, now they might not have been hardcore violent segregationists, but they're still taking in the same type of mentality, the same type of impulses that are compelling their actions. And we still have to, even though West Virginia is progressive, it is still segregationist, especially when we get down to southern West Virginia. And we all, I think, know that. It is a complex, even though Huntington doesn't really engage in the same type of racial violence that exists in the southern coalfields for a variety of factors, that doesn't mean that it's still not a segregated situation. Yes, sir.
Is your interest more in railroads or in Appalachia?
Am I interested in railroads or Appalachia?
Which was foremost?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought about that. I don't want to be known as, well, if I had to, how can I say this? I do not want to be authority on the all things black rubric. Because I think that there should be multiple voices in investigating the black circumstance within West Virginia as well as Appalachia. I haven't thought of myself as either. I thought of myself as someone who was uncovering a story that hadn't been told. And so that's where the rubber meets the road for me. I want to, whatever drives me, whatever I can find a compelling story, that's what I want to illuminate. And if it happens to be based in a black circumstance, or happens to be based in Appalachia, great. And I'm actually giving a lecture up at WVU next week about a gentleman by the name of Charles Ringo, who was a former Buffalo soldier, who becomes a former Buffalo soldier, becomes a desperado criminal, who is acquitted of the murders of his two stepchildren, who's acquitted of the murder of a prominent white couple in Kankakee, Illinois, who travels the rail lines engaging in gambling, working at carnivals, and who is, in essence, I believe, a man who has a very fascinating story to tell, who is a product of a society that doesn't allow him opportunities because of his color and because of his disability. He's got some type of affliction on his arm. Despite that, he's still chased. There's a detective agency that is hired out of Chicago that tracks him literally to Mexico, they say, to retrieve him. And he is convicted of the brutal murders of this prominent white couple, despite the fact that the person had to climb through a window, wield an axe, and do some superhuman things. But again, not to paint the story one-sided, only through the 11th hour testimony of a sheriff in adjacent county who says he couldn't have committed the murders. He was in my jail cell at the time, having been arrested for trying to commit a burglary. Only through that 11th hour testimony is he saved. And in fact, the Jewish detective agency that was hired to find him, they are convicted of perjury, and 4 of the 5 members of that group are sent to jail. The one lady actually escapes, runs through a window to escape being jailed. So anyway, these are kind of, I found this guy doing research on Black Huntington. And it was just a small little grain. I followed him, and so now I've got a roughly 10-year, no, I take it back, a 20-year expanse of his life that I think is interesting. Hey, Greg.
I was going to ask if you had done any studies on free people of color, which interests me because there is a whole subculture, really, of free people of color that are not slaves.
Yes.
That oftentimes you find are the blacksmiths in communities. I'm thinking of Monroe County, Greenbrier County, even up into Kanawha County and Cabell County. And those free people of color oftentimes have to sign their names on lists, you know, for the sheriff.
Sure.
Before the Civil War.
Only as far as Cabell County, only as far as the free blacks that I discuss in my dissertation are found in Guyandot and Barboursville areas, the more commercialized areas of Cabell County. I'm trying now to work on the book prospectus, and so I'm going to investigate a little bit more. It is one of the interesting things, at least I find interesting, is the importance of White Sulphur Springs as a nexus for black community and black communication in antebellum and postbellum West Virginia, because you have these blacks who are working at the Greenbrier, White Sulphur Springs, who are gaining insight and information that they are disseminating, from whites and about whites. They are disseminating to blacks, who then will travel to other parts, free blacks who travel to other parts. And to me, that is a critical element to the migratory process. How do blacks, considering that the southern part of this state is the most ardent Confederate sympathizers, how did blacks actually navigate that region? How do they know the safe houses to go to? How do they know what people to avoid? We're not talking a walk through the park here. We're talking several-day journey over mountains. And Booker T. Washington talks about the difficulty of coming over the Appalachians and then coming in. So my belief is that there was an underground network, grapevine, that hasn't been talked about, but I think is really important to understanding the ability of black people to negotiate and navigate their new circumstances. Civil War ends, 6 years later, a railroad begins. That is a sea change in a really truncated, compacted time frame. Yes, sir.
Did you come across the concept of sundown towns?
Oh, yes, sir.
I wrote extensively about that, mostly in the border areas where it cropped up, that sort of initially probably Plessy versus Ferguson,
sure,
and then on into the teens and 20s.
Sure, yes, sir. And in fact, when I taught at Marshall, some of my students who grew up in Milton remember seeing the signs about, black people had to be out of town. I never saw them. Did you ever see them?
In Texas.
Yeah.
So, I was raised in Texas.
But they existed, growing up in Huntington, we knew there are certain areas to avoid, and by all means we avoided them. But to have my students say that they remember that sign in Milton.
I interviewed a fellow who was a descendant of Barbersville
Yes.
folks, and he said he remembered there being a sign that said, "No dogs or hens allowed on the lawn."
And so
Yeah.
we're not that far
So
removed.
they did not go there.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Could you dispel the rumor that C.P. Huntington was located his railroad in Guyandotte if it wasn't for some individual incident that took
Right.
place between him and a...
Yeah, that's a good story. My sense is, I think Huntington had sent his, I guess cronies or investigators, as early, I think as 1865, folks have been contemplating this railroad. You know, maybe 1866. I don't know enough if he ever actually, you know, if it was his definitive decision that Huntington, then called various names, Maple Grove or Holdaby's Landing or whatever it was called, would actually be the site. You would like to think the man of that intellect and savvy wouldn't have based his decision on something as, you know, what, asinine as a horse, you know. Yeah. So, but I tell you what, his decision, I wouldn't be here. You know, I wouldn't be here if he hadn't made his decision. Thank you all for the wonderful opportunity. I really appreciate you spending time on your Thursday afternoon or Thursday evening. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your interest. It is as I tell folks, wherever I go, I'm a black West Virginian, and I carry it with pride, and I try to tell the story as far and wide. I think there's a great deal of to be proud of in this state, certainly, and there's still a great deal of history to be uncovered. And I strongly encourage you, as you engage in your daily lives, to interest people in the history of this state, and certainly the black circumstance as well. Thank you.